Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Selnar's Minis. Today I am going to paint a Reaper Miniatures Goblin Shaman. As always, paint fearlessly. It's just paint and you can fix any mistakes. Also, please like and or subscribe to my channel to help it grow and to receive notifications. Before you use all the paints that I used, there will be 2 screens of this time. A little bit more paints than normal, but I think it was well worth it. You will also find the list of the paints in the description below. As always, I start this process off with removing as many mold lines as possible and priming the miniature in white. Okay, and we're going to start off with some Army Painter Speed Paints 2.0. I'm going to start off by applying burnt moss to this Goblin Shaman skin. I wanted to go for a darker color Goblin, kind of show he's aged quite a bit, he's been around for a while, and a little bit more powerful. So I'm just going to apply this to all the spots that are ultimately going to be skinned, and I will do this twice because I feel that the first layer was just a little too light. May have been a combination of the paint on white primer and some of the bones gray showing through. So I just wanted a good coverage, went ahead and applied it twice and moved on from there. After the burnt moss had dried, I went ahead and applied paint to the cloak and the shoes. I wanted these to be a dark leather, so I used Army Painter's dark bark to achieve the base layer. As with the burnt moss, I felt that I needed to apply 2 layers of this to get good and even coverage. And later on in the video, I will go ahead and add some different colors to this dark bark in order to get some variation between the shoes and the cloak. As you can see, our Goblin Shaman has a rather sizable spider on his back. I'm going to go around and try to avoid getting too much of this dark bark on it. I will also try to avoid getting any of the other colors as I go around to paint this on it as well. Spoiler alert, I kind of failed and ended up having to paint a little bit more of this white than I thought I would, given how careful I was trying to be. But that's okay, like I said, it's just paint, can be fixed. So I'm going to go around and apply this dark bark to the cloak and the shoes. I'm going to do it twice to get good coverage, and when I come back, we're going to fast forward a little bit because I forgot to hit record while I was doing the little cowl he has and his loincloth. As you can see, I'm painting it. This is Fire Giant Orange. This paint I also felt like I needed to do 2 layers. Again, I don't know if it's just the paint on primer I'm using and the fact that there's some like light gray from the Bones Black line showing through, but I definitely with these speed paints felt like I had to do 2 layers to get good coverage. So moving on from speed paints to regular Army Painter paints, I am going to go ahead and paint the wood of the staff. A field gray is what it's called. It's basically a greenish gray to give it a nice like old worn wooden look. Once I was done painting the wood on the staff, I went around and started to do all the bones on the model. There's a skull at the top of the staff that's really obvious I'm working on right now. There's a femur cross piece that you can see underneath the skull. And then he's wearing these smaller femurs as a necklace across his chest and belly. It makes me kind of wonder where he got those from. You know what I mean? And I also decided to do all of the beads for the bracelet around his wrist as bone, thinking of them more as like knuckle bones or something of that nature. You know, he's kind of got a spider on his back. He's a little sinister, you know? So after I do that, I get out my leather brown from my ivory painter, and I'm going to go ahead and do the pouch on the front here. This doesn't take me very long. And I'm going to cover up some of that orange that got on it. Okay, so here's where we're at after we finish the pouch on this goblin. And I still have some things to paint, mainly the ropes that are on the goblin. So the rope holding the loincloth and the pouch, the rope on the necklace, and the rope on the cloak. I'm going to go ahead and apply Vallejo's Khaki to those in order to start that. And then from there, I'm going to begin the process of highlighting up the shoes. Right after I apply a leather brown base coat to the metal medallion on his cowl. Okay, so to do the leather for the shoes, I took the leather brown that I had on my palette and I mixed it with the dark bark. So I started off with a 1:2 ratio, so 1 part leather brown to 2 parts dark bark, and moved my way up to eventually 2 parts leather brown to 1 part dark bark, enough so that you can get some differentiation between the different layers. So I'm going to go around and do this, and then when I come back, we'll be talking about another portion of the model. Alright, after finishing up highlighting the shoes, I'm going to go around and apply shades to this model in all the areas that are not covered in speed paints. I am also going to have the drop Cs. You'll see me drop the model again, I believe, at least once or twice more in this video. Don't know what was going on with that, but that was a thing. I'm going to go ahead and use several shades on this model. I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade, which I used for the staff and all the bones. I use Seraphim Sepia on the rope, and I'm going to go around and apply it so I feel like it's got decent coverage. I wanted kind of a dirty look for the bones, so I applied it a little heavier there. And then once I'm done with this, I'll come back and start talking to you about what I'm doing next. Alright, so here's the last of me applying the shade to the model, and then I'm going to start in on working on the base. So I've already finished the feet at this point, so I wanted to get the base started. So I'm going to go ahead and go around with Army Painter's Dungeon Gray and start applying this to all the stonework on the ground. It's pretty simple, straightforward. I just had to be careful around the feet not to get any of that gray on the leather shoes. I wanted a much darker looking leather for the cloak. It appears quite heavy and has some very heavy folds in it. So in order to simulate this, I decided to use oak brown with the dark bark. They are somewhat similar in color, but the oak brown has a little bit more red in it, and it's just slightly lighter than the dark bark. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to apply our initial highlights. And we're going to start off with 2 parts dark bark and 1 part oak brown. And we're going to go around and apply this to all the ridges and all the places I want to be highlighted, and at the edges of the cloak as well. And we're just going to keep on moving our way up to highlight this cloak by going through a series of steps, just like with the shoes. So ultimately, by the time we're done, we're going to end up with something that's 1 part dark bark and I believe 3 parts oak brown. So I have a series of steps in between. I have this initial one that I told you, which is 2 parts dark bark and 1 part oak brown, and then we're going to go to 1 part dark bark and 1 part oak brown, and then 1 to 2, again, dark bark, oak brown, and then ultimately that 1 to 3 ratio that I was telling you about. And at some parts, especially near the rip and the very edges of the cloak, I'm going to use just pure oak brown. And this gives this a nice, old, rich, very dark leather look. And I really like the way this turned out. After the cloak, I went ahead and started to work a little bit more on the goblin himself. I started off with using Army Painter's red black for the mouth. I'm just going to go ahead and block that in advance. Um, I like this color for mouths and old sores and things like that. It's just a nice, good color for that. After finishing the mouth, I started to work on highlighting this goblin's skin up. I wanted him to have a darker skin color, so for this, I went with Reaper Miniatures Ancient Oak and mixed it in with the original color of Burnt Moss. Burnt Moss is actually darker than the Reaper Ancient Oak, so I'm going to start off with my typical 1 to 2 ratio, which is going to be 1 part Ancient Oak to 2 parts Burnt Moss. And as you can see, I dropped the miniature again. And I'm going to go ahead and apply this to all the areas I think that would be exposed to the light. And then I'm going to go continue to highlight up. So the next stage is going to be a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 part Ancient Oak to 1 part Burnt Moss. And then it's going to go to 2 parts Ancient Oak and 1 part Burnt Moss. And then to that mixture, I'm going to add like 1 part Goblin Green to get some of my brighter highlights. So I'm going to go around and highlight all the spots on this goblin where I think the skin has been exposed to the light. And we're going to go from there. I'll be back in a few moments. So while I paint the skin, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about my inspiration for painting models. A lot of it comes from my imagination. A good portion of it comes from my imagination fueled by ancient civilizations and cultures. This is not the case with the goblin. I don't have this based on any culture whatsoever. He is just a guy in my head who, for me, goblins are part of folklore and mythology, and so my imagination runs pretty hard with that. The green skin is an influence from Games Workshop, whether I want to admit it or not, because their goblins are green. Well, classically, goblins in a lot of other folklore and even in old Dungeons and Dragons are kind of an ochre color. I personally like the green. It adds a little bit more character. I find them very mischievous and very cunning, but not necessarily evil. I might make an exception for this guy. I mean, he's got a giant spider on his back, and he is out to like mess people up. Uh, what would I use this miniature for? A lot of things, actually. I'd use it for Rangers of Shadow Deep as an enemy. I would use it for Mordheim if I wanted to do a Orc and Goblin band. Or I could use it for Oathmark and use it along with my elves, because my idea for my Oathmark army is an elf goblin army. Not to say that my elves are evil, and not to say that he's necessarily evil, but he does have a little bit of a sinister bent, just given the way he's standing, his posture, and all this. So, yes, these are the inspirations that I get, for games and just for painting. Like I said, for me, this guy is a little bit more sinister, and he has a little bit more nefarious ideas. Maybe not directed at his friends, but definitely at his enemies. Alright, so I'm going to go around and continue to paint the skin, and I'll be back here in a little bit. While I continue to paint the skin on this Goblin Shaman, I have a quick question for the viewers who made it this far into the video. I'd like to know what you'd like to see me do next. I would like to know if you'd like me to paint another goblin, or if you'd want me to paint an elf for the Oathmark army that this model might be part of. Or if you'd like me to paint something completely different. I do have other models I could paint. Obviously fantasy. I do have some sci-fi. If you can leave me a comment down below, I will take a look at that and I will review those. Also, I may just do a questionnaire and see what people want to do and post it on YouTube, and people can vote there. Alright, continuing on painting the skin. After finishing with the skin, I moved on to the staff. To highlight this, I went back to the original field gray color and hit all the areas that I felt that the light was hitting the staff, and then provided an additional highlight by mixing Dungeon Gray 1-to-1 with the field gray to get a lighter gray coloration. Once I finished with the staff, I moved on to the orange cloth, that being the loincloth and the skull cap he's wearing, and returned to the original Fire Giant Orange I used and mixed it in with Mythic Orange. My first highlight was a 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 parts Fire Giant to 1 part Mythic Orange. The second highlight was a 1-to-1 ratio of both of those paints. And then the last highlight that was done was a 1-to-2 ratio, 1 part Fire Giant to 2 parts Mythic Orange. I then followed that up with some edge highlights along the skull cap strands and the very edge of the loincloth with Mythic Orange. Alright, so forgive the fuzzy quality of the video. This is the only shot I took of this, and so decided to keep it. But basically, there's a medallion on the skull cap that I had painted brown earlier that I painted with weapon bronze from Army Painter to give it a metallic look. After I had finished with the medallion, I returned to the leather pouch in the front of the model. I applied a base layer over the top part of it in order to clean it up a little bit. And from there, I mixed leather brown with monster brown to a 1-to-1 ratio and applied a smaller highlight, and then finally took just pure monster brown and did the smallest highlight on top of that. So after the pouch, I turned my sights to the rope on the model. I returned to Vallejo Khaki and did little strokes in order to highlight it back up and make it look like rope. And did an additional layer in which I did 1 part Vallejo Khaki to 1 part Army Painter Desert Tan. After I finished with the ropes, I turned my attention to all the bones found on the model. I returned to skeleton bone and brought that base layer back up, but left some of the Agrax Earthshade in the deepest parts in order to give it some contrast. After I was done with returning the skeleton bone to all the areas I wanted to highlight back up, I then started to mix in Army Painter's Bleached Bone from their airbrush line and slowly build up the highlights on the various bones until I was happy with the look. Again, the ratio is a 2-to-1, a 1-to-1, and then a 1-to-2. That being Army Painter's skeleton bone to bleached bone. And I do believe there's a couple places that I use just pure bleached bone to give the highest highlights. After I had highlighted all the bones on the model, I turned my attention to the spider on the back of the shaman. There were several places in which the dark bark, the fire giant, and some of the burnt moss had touched the spider. And the color I wanted to use is a much lighter color, and these colors would shine through. So in order to get a good coverage, I cleaned up the spider with white in all the areas in which the other paints had touched. After that, I went ahead and applied this other speed paint color called Blinding Light. It's a very light gray color, and the white underneath would definitely show through. However, before I applied the holy light to the spider, I got distracted by the nail head in the middle of the skull's forehead. I decided to paint that with Creamcoat Iron Oxide, and trying to be a little bit sinister dark with this, I made it look like water had been running down the front of that skull for a while and caused some of the orange rust to flow down the front of the skull as well. And realized that the bronze medallion on the front of the skull cap looked a little too clean, so I added a little bit, but not a lot, of anelic oxide to give it a little bit of a corroded look. Here's how the model looks after applying those paints. I decided to go ahead and paint the sclera of the eyes a yellow off camera, and decided to try on camera to paint the pupils. I did a pretty decent job as far as I'm concerned, considering how hard this was to do. I had also off camera painted the goblin's teeth so you can see his teeth. And then I went ahead and decided to try to paint his lower lip. For this, I mixed ancient oak and burnt moss to a 1-to-1 ratio and added in a little bit of alien purple to give it a darker color. After I'd finished painting the lip, I decided to try and paint his eyebrows, and originally I thought I was just going to do like a dark gray, but I decided that it was too light, so I went ahead and added a little black and did some little dots to show where some of the darker hairs would be on his eyebrows. And after I finished that, I finally applied the holy light to the spider. As you can see, it's a pretty light gray. It's going to give some contrast, but it's not going to be super stark. I'm pretty happy with this. And after this had dried, I decided that the spider needed something just a little bit more to make it pop out a little bit. So I took some dragon red and started to put little dots on the abdomen and in the joint spaces between all the segments on the legs. Okay, and here is the video of me applying that dragon red to the spider's abdomen and to the spaces in between the leg joints. I will apologize for the fuzziness. I don't know what happened, but it's a thing that I'm working on, and I'm going to continue to work on in order to give you the guys the best view as possible. Here is the finished version of the model. Thank you again for watching. I really appreciate you, your time and your energy. I was pretty happy on the way this model turned out. If you guys can let me know in the comments, as I had mentioned earlier, if you'd like to see me paint another goblin, or if you'd like me to paint an elf for my Oathmark army, or if you want me to paint a sci-fi model, please let me know, once again, in the comments. And you guys have an awesome day. Please take a moment to like this video if you have not, or to subscribe to me so you can keep up to date on what I'm doing. And I will talk to you later. Thank you very much. Bye.